Thank you, Dr. Makeshwar. That was a brilliant keynote. We are now beginning our first session with the title Multilingual Scholars and Scholarly Practice. We have 3 scholars presenting today. I'll introduce each of you before your paper, sort of appearing in between, and then we'll have the Q&A at the end of our session. Our first speaker is Claire Gallien, a senior lecturer in English studies at the University of Montpellier, 3e, but her engagement with Arabic languages and literatures is long-standing, focusing now in the traditional Islamic sciences. Her research interests are anchored in the critical study of Orientalist discourse, post-colonial, comparative, and world literatures and theories, as well as in translation studies and decolonial theory and practices. She's currently working on 2 book projects, one a monograph entitled From Corpus to Canon, Orientalist Appropriation and Reconfiguration of Eastern Literary Traditions in 17th and 18th century Britain. And secondly, a co-edited volume on Islam and New Directions in World Literature, contracted with Edinburgh University Press. She's published numerous chapters and collected books and articles in international journals, including Journal of Postcolonial Writing, Journal of Commonwealth Literature, Translation Studies. She was also the guest editor of a special issue of the Journal of Postcolonial Writing on refugee literature, and another special issue, on contemporary Anglo-Arab literature for Commonwealth Essays and Studies. Her paper today is entitled Multilingual Commentary Literatures of the Islamicate and the Role in Early Modern Orientalism. We've already established, Claire, that you have the ability to share your PowerPoint, so no suspense there. Everyone, I'll send out a message at the 17-minute mark to my panelists, and that's how you know. Okay, looking forward to it. Claire, please take it away.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much for this very kind presentation. Thank you to the organizers of this conference, Hany Rashwan, Huda Fakhreddine, and you, David. I'm really delighted and to be part of the work and part of what promises to be, 3 very stimulating days of research and thinking together. So thank you once again. The work I'm going to present to you today is original in the sense that I've not published on the, it stems from, it is articulated to the monograph I'm currently working and finishing, hopefully, which you mentioned from the. So during the 17th centuries, British Orientalists collected a massive amount of Persian, and later, as they went to India, started colonization of India, so Indic languages as well, including Sanskrit. That was to furnish the rapidly expanding collections of the university libraries of Oxford and Cambridge in the first place, but then also the British Museum, India House, the Royal Society, and also their own private libraries. The objectives were varied, depending on the period we're looking at, and also the interests of the Orientalists themselves. They range from developing biblical studies to enhancing the cultural capital of these institutions I've mentioned, but also earning a personal reputation. The main channels used to collect manuscripts and ship them to Britain were the Levant Company in the Mediterranean region and the East India Company for the Indian subcontinent. It involved the people working the Orientalists on history, have emphasized the reliance of British and more generally European Orientalists on local networks of knowledge, thereby undermining the myth of an unmediated transfer and of a direct access to Eastern quote-unquote originals or original this, but there is really the interaction and I to say what I would like to do here is to equally important to the construction of and equally deleted historiography commentary literature, which was collected by British Orientalists in manuscript format in the multiple languages of the Islamicate. So since we're looking, I mean, the corpus I'm looking at is mainly in Arabic, Persian, and Ottoman Turkish as well. So a corpus which is being, on which they heavily relied for the so this aspect of the construction of Orientalist knowledge has been given very scant attention, and even less studied than the contributions of native scholars and native intermediaries. There's been, I mean, there's been one study really related to the use of tafsir, and tafasir, I should say, in the translation of the Quran. So we've got a bit of that here, but really the use of commentary literature is much wider than just helping Orientalists retranslate the Quran in the 17th and 18th century. So again, could a bit more detail, but since my time is short, I will just move to the main part of my contribution. So what I want to say is that outside the Quran case, no systematic study on the multilingual sharh literature, that is its material presence in Orientalist libraries. And this is what I'd like to say also, there are two kinds of the material presence and the palimpsestic presence. So the material presence in the Orientalist libraries, but also the palimpsestic presence in the Orientalist archive. So no such systematic study has been proposed yet. The conference gives me occasion just to take a first critical step in reconstructing the presence of this forgotten corpus. So why the amnesia and why we need to reminisce? When I started working on the catalogs of Oriental manuscripts collected in the 17th and 18th century by British Orientalists, and the main catalog I'm referring here is the 1787 Johannes Juri's catalog of the Bodleian Eastern collections or Oriental collections. So I noticed something that surprised me, and I'm recording the surprise because I do believe it says a lot about what Shen Bar Itzhak called intellectual captivity. Indeed, the categories that we take for granted and apply casually are constructions, we all know this. But these constructions obliterate other modes of categorizing, perceiving, and thinking about the world. So even though I had been researching on early modern Orientalism, like I said, for a good number of years, and writing about it, there were still certain aspects which I had not sufficiently examined. And among these aspects, the definition or remit of what it is that they, the Orientalists, and we still, from the sort of global North academia, call literature and what we call, quote unquote, an original source. So because we are only in the early stage of thinking about these categories in non and other than Eurocentric terms, the academia in the global North is barely starting to recognize that these categories can no longer be taken for granted and applied irrespective of the corpus it is working with. In France, we have not even started to reach this stage of recognition and are still very much, I believe, in the thick of denial. We take for granted, for instance, the fact that behind a title, there is a work. This is what I call nominalist fallacy. That is, one title, one work only. We also define languages and the literatures written in them as monolingual by default. Right. However, this way of thinking about literary cultures and languages is not universal, and applying it indiscriminately is a form of epistemic captivity, the ones produced by Orientalists, and that we may end up repeating ourselves to this day. So how is it that I was habituated not to see the commentary and not to see the commentary as a primary source to look at and to think with? Is this heedlessness? Is this heedlessness towards the commentary the sort of a remnant of Orientalism? Why do we de-link to rethink these categories? So during the research I carried out on the catalogs of manuscripts collected by early for the book I'm preparing, I encountered a significant amount of what we would call commentary literature, that is sharh. Orientalists collected commentaries en masse. Like I said, commentaries are interpreted, but these commentaries are still interpreted as secondary sources, coming after and discussing a primary source. There is here a hierarchy between primary and secondary sources. No matter how relevant and cutting edge the commentary might be, its very existence is contingent upon the existence of a primary source. It is precisely because European Orientalists operated within this intellectual framework that they viewed commentaries as appendages to other texts considered as proper literature, and therefore as proper object of translations. So commentaries function in Orientalist prose just dispel, obscurities in the text, and there were mere tools that could be and would be, written out of the world of letters. Now, this hierarchy, however, runs against the epistemic framework from which the text is studied originated. Indeed, the ranking of original texts above commentaries would appear problematic, to say the least, to an Islamic scholar, since the foundational texts, the matn, are usually short and dense, and they necessitate commentary. Sharh, hashiya, ta'liqa. Commentaries have often superseded the matn, in fact, in terms of popularity and authoritativeness. So, just to be brief, what the catalogue signaled was, first, the existence of a commentary corpus from the earliest time of Orientalist manuscript collection. Second, the acknowledgement by Orientalists of the existence of critical thinking and critical tradition in the East. The collecting and relying on this critical thinking. Fourth, eventual erasure in published Orientalist works and translation of that critical thinking. So by taking the commentary corpus into consideration, I'm not merely providing a missing link in the history of Orientalist knowledge, saying, okay, he relied on this and this. The research I'm exposing today has further literary, epistemic, and political ramifications. One is to rethink critically about the categories we use. I said category of literature, primary, secondary sources, original source, for instance. Another ramification, the political one, is to return to, a provocative title that Hamid Dabashi had not so long ago, of Can Non-Europeans Think? Okay, so my point is not to lend bad intentions to Orientalists and present them as evil, ugly characters bent on depreciating and deprecating Eastern literatures. I think this would be too easy. And honestly, not a very fruitful caricature. I'm more interested to think about the political ramifications of excising literary criticism and commentaries from the translated canon of Eastern literatures. In other words, what it meant to erase the commentary and what it means for us today to recover it as palimpsest. So I don't know if I've got much time left. Oh, how is the internet connection? And
I can see and hear you all right.
Hear you fine now, Claire. Please go ahead.
I'm sorry. I'm just okay. Do I have five minutes left? Would that be okay?
Sure,
Right.
yes, you do.
Yeah, because obviously it's very short, but I needed really to give you this frame, then to look at the materials. I would just be like in the last 5 minutes, and I apologize for that because it's little time on the corpus itself. But I had just one example to look at. This was my example. My title was Noah Hafiz without the Turkish polyglot commentators. Because Hafiz was a well-known poet, you know, in the 18th century England. His ghazal, I mean, had been translated for a good number of years, but you know, since the very beginning of the 18th century to the end of the 18th century. At the end of the 18th century, you even get 2 volumes, which are, you know, solely dedicated to Hafiz ghazal. Now, what is interesting is that so the first volume on Hafiz was published by British Orientalist called Richard 74. Clear from the very title page of his publication that he actually did more, he redid an existing Latin version. I'm going to take the camera away. He redid from an existing Latin version, right? But in that version, he also says, and this appears at the corner of a footnote, really, that he depended on Sudi, Sururi, and other learned Turkish commentators of Hafiz for his translation. And when you look, so actually into the translation, in Richardson's translation, there is the manifest reference, and there are the latent references. So I'm looking at, you know, the palimpsest here. There are four references in footnotes in Richardson translation to Turkish commentators. I can give you the pages 14, 15, 21, 15, and 60. What is interesting in that, in these four different quotes, direct quotes, he mentions various commentators, Turkish commentators, and infallibly, him and actually other translators in English favor Sudi over the other Turkish commentators of Hafiz. And always the reason is, I mean, the reason is that they think that Sudi is giving a grammatical, dry commentary of Hafiz, and he doesn't go into the mystical reading of Hafiz. And this is for Orientalists a proof of scientificity. And so he mentions just in passing another interpretation by Sururi to dismiss Sururi, because Sururi, and you know, this is a Sururi interpreting Hafiz in the light of Islamic spirituality and mysticism. So this is just one example. I could go on for a long time, but I will stop here. Maybe just to conclude here, I would say that there are 2 points which I wanted to underline. One is the avowed reliance of Orientalists on commentary literature of the Islamicate. And the second is the multilingual nature of that commentary literature. The second takeaway is the move to reconsider the ways in which we conceptualize the role of European scholars in the transfer of Eastern literatures to the West, to Europe. Far from the heroic biographies of Orientalists as Islamicate commentary literature testify to their reliance and their dependence, not only on grammars and dictionaries, but also on the critical thinking of Eastern scholars, Islamicate, from the Islamicate. It should force us, I think, also to question the universal relevance of the national and the monolingual frame used in our discussion about literature today. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Thank
And
you.
sorry for the poor connection.
It's not your fault. And in truth, it evened out after the first 5 or so minutes. It was great. Thank you so much. And we're doing great on time, everyone. So don't let me delay in introducing our second panelist of the session. Ali Karjoo-Ravary is the Josephine H. Detmer and Zareen Taj Mirza Assistant Professor of Islamic Studies at Bucknell University. He holds a PhD and an MA in Religious Studies from the University of Pennsylvania. Research interests include Sufism, poetry, and kingship in the late medieval to early modern Islamic East. His paper today is entitled A Brocade of Many Textures, Literary Trilingualism in 14th Century Anatolia, Iran, and Beyond. Please take it away, Ali.
Is it back?
Not yet.
Okay.
Yes, it's on now. If you just go full screen.
Okay.
Perfect.
Good.
Yep.
All right. So I'd like to begin by thanking Huda, Hany, David, and Rawad for all their hard work in bringing us together here today. In my excitement to be with you all, my talk ended up being different from the abstract I had proposed, though I'll aim to touch on elements of what I set out to do there. And in fact, in a touch of fate, it actually builds on what Professor Keshavaz's talk was about. And I hope it's satisfactory in a sense as a response. As today I'll attempt to deal with Mulamma poetry from the 13th and the 14th centuries between Iran and Anatolia, particularly in the Sufi context. So as many of you know, Mulamma means to make something multicolored, or well, it means a poetry that consciously mixes languages, right? It's often translated as macaronic poetry because of the existence of similar phenomena in Europe, but I won't be dealing with that in any way. To make something mulamma means to make it multicolored or colorful. It's something woven with many colors. It can mean a patchwork garment, as well as a garment that intentionally combines colors or which shines, likely with metallic threads. And the word comes from the root lama'a, which means to flash or to gleam or shine. Lum'a is a flash, such as when lightning flashes, which is an important poetic symbol. And talmi, therefore, is the process of making something gleam or shine, but also refers to the act of writing mulamma poetry. It's unclear when this term came to be used in the Persianate context first, and it never seems to have come to mean the same thing in the Arabic tradition. In a tradition, though, which depicts the composition of poetry as an act of weaving, it makes sense to use it for multilingual poetry in the sense of a garment which combines many different languages, and therefore becoming metaphorically multicolored. And throughout the centuries, this image of different languages as different types of fabric actually gained currency. Now, regardless of its origin, it's clear that early on, many new Persian poets consciously mixed Arabic into their poems as a way of flexing their poetic muscle. And by the 12th century, it was such an established term that when Rashiduddin Vatvat in Hadaiq as-Sihr fi Daqa'iq ash-Shi'r on Persian poetics, he just simply defines mulamma as a craft in which one brings a line in Arabic, tazi, and a line in Persian, parsi, or a couplet or 2 or 10, which I take as meaning without end, right? It just means mixing it, with no reflection on why it's called this or anything like that. And this definition doesn't really change over the centuries. And in fact, in the 20th century, the poet and professor Jalaluddin Humayi gives nearly the same definition, only adding that it's considered as a type of badi' in Persian. rooting it basically in the first flowering of Persian literature with the time of Rudaki. I'm not going to create an overarching theory though, and I want to focus today specifically on the significance of the practice among Sufis in the 13th and 14th century in the Western Turco-Persian world, where multilingualism between Arabic, Persian, and Turkish was part and parcel of daily life. So in terms of the actual practice of mulamma poetry, we have this account by Ibn Battuta from the early 14th century, where he describes when he visited the court of Muhammad Khajeh Khwarazmi, who was ruling the city of Azak, which is today's Azov, under the reign of Uzbek Khan of the Golden Horde. And he wrote that when at court, after the meal was served and they stopped eating, the Quran reciters recited with a beautiful voice, a pulpit was set up, a preacher went up with the Quran readers sitting in front of him. He just delivered a sermon in Arabic, praying for everyone there. He was eloquent, and he immediately interpreted yufassiruhu bit-Turki. He interpreted for them in Turkish. And then in the midst of this, the Quran readers would repeat verses from the Quran in a wondrous refrain, tarjih. Then they would begin to sing first in Arabic, which they called qawl, and then in Persian and Turkish, which they called mulamma. And this scene is actually common to many courts in the 14th century in particular, including the court that I'll talk about at the end of my talk. And in many of these places, it was the poetry of Sufis that would be recited. And in fact, Ibn Battuta himself mentions that Anatolia at this time and the regions around it were basically regions where Sufism and its followers reigned supreme. And from the 13th century onward, we begin seeing Sufi ritual and court ritual begin to mirror each other in greater and greater degrees of intensity. I mean, the calling that qawl, I mean, the word qawwali, which is a term used in Persian and South Asian languages for Sufi singing, it's coming from this tradition, right? This repetition of that word. Now, in both of these, after the recitation of the Quran, in both Sufi ritual and in court ritual, after the recitation of the Quran and Arabic prayer litanies, poetry would be sung in Arabic, Persian, and other languages. And in some places, this poetry is reported to have been ecstatically composed during such ceremony, as is famously the case with the famous Sufi Rumi, who we've already been introduced to, and who is a remarkable multilingual poet. Now, Rumi's poetry, for anyone who's read it, is full of Arabic, and even at times includes glimmers of Turkish, Greek, and even a word or two of Armenian. Now, while it's true that a lot of his multilingual poetry has the taste of the Khanaqah, it's Khanaqahi poetry, that is, the Khanaqah is the gathering place of Sufis. And by this, what I mean is that it includes refrains that are from the Quran and prayers, so it has this sense of dhikr, this remembrance of God. Rumi himself was enamored with Arabic poetry, particularly al-Mutanabbi. And in fact, he even has poems where he includes famous lines of Mutanabbi as part of his act of talmiyah, such as here, which I'll only read 3 lines of the longer poem because I'm sure I don't have enough time to say everything that I want to say today. And in the translations that are to follow, if the translation is in yellow, it's Arabic; if it's in white, it's in Persian, and later, if it's in Turkish, it's in red. So just to read this to you. در لطف اگر بروی شاه همه چمنی در قهر اگر بروی گه که را زبان بکنی دانی که بر گل تو بلبل چه ناله کند ابل الهوى اسفا یوما نوى بدنی آن دم که دم بزنم با تو ز خود بروم ولولا مخاطبتی ایاک لم ترنی. Now, the translation is here for those of you who are interested in that. I wanted you to hear it because a lot of times when we talk about Rumi, because of the mystical and ecstatic Sufi nature of his poetry, we sometimes forget that he also had a technical mastery of poetry. And we see that particularly in this poem, because the meter of this poem, from this famous poem from Mutanabbi is Basit Makhbun. So mustaf'ilun fa'ilun, mustaf'ilun fa'ilun, which in Persian is very difficult to compose to. In fact, in the century before Rumi, the Seljuk court poet Amir Mu'azzi writes a qasida in it. The qasida starting with Ezwal del Bareman Porbando Porshekani Gahi Cho Va'de U Gahi Cho Pushtamani. And he ends this qasida with Goftam Setayish to Bar Wazn She'r Arab. تقطیع آن به عروض الا چنین نکنی مستفعلون فعلون مستفعلون فعلون ابل الهوى اسفا یوما نوى بدنی. That is, it's such a rare meter in Persian that he's boasting about it. He's like, and he's showing, look, this is Mutanabbi's poem. I did a talmi of it, and I made an entire qasida in this rhyme. And in fact, Saadi also has a poem in this meter, and what he does is that he also talks about how, wow, I did this Arabic. So if a master like him is saying it, it shows that it's difficult to compose in this meter. And the fact that Rumi composed in it, in fact, Rumi composes in it twice, and the other time is also Mullah Ma'po, is a merit to Rumi's poetic achievement. But he doesn't really point out his skill. Rather, his use of Mutanabbi is part of a larger move whereby everything for him is an indicator pointing to the ultimate beloved, who is God. Especially in the poem above, by leading with a theological pairing of lutf wa qahr, gentleness and severity, as well as the other lines of the poem which I didn't include, such as what he says, like, through your mercy, no matter my sin, you won't cut my heart off from you. He makes the divine nature of his beloved clear, and thus it's the Sufi nature of the poem. And here, of course, we're seeing an elevated and skillful example of it with Arabic, but there are also other examples from his life. For instance, in the 14th century hagiographical account of his life, Manaqib al-Arifin by Shamsuddin Aflaki, he reports that one day one of the disciples saw Rumi in the madrasa pacing back and forth, reciting in Arabic with utmost seriousness and gravity. And this is kind of vulgar, so please forgive me if you're not used to hearing that from me. He says, Bainul fakhadain nisfu daniqun, Ainul fakhadain daniqain, Ra'sun dakhaluhu a'ati dirhamin, Kullun dakhaluhu dirhamain, which means between the thighs a dram, the top of the thighs 2 drams, to enter with a head give a dirham, to enter all the way 2 dirhams. Now the companion was bewildered because here Rumi is reciting these lines completely serious, not laughing, and just pacing back and forth. And these lines are famous lines that were used by prostitutes in Syria and other Arab lands. And so as he's lost in his thoughts, the story goes that Rumi looks up and says, the meaning of these lines is that whoever wants to take one step into the world of poverty, a term, which is a term for the Sufi path to God, must give up a quarter of the world. And whoever wants to grasp the secret of travel within it must give up half of the world. But whoever wants to enter Muhammadan poverty must give up the entire world. And whoever wants to perfect that Muhammadan poverty must give up both this world and the next world. Only then will they be united with the presence of the master. And then he ends with a Persian poem. Now, my intention in sharing both of these examples, one incredibly high, one incredibly sort of the opposite, is to emphasize that what for Rumi was an expression of his sanctity, that everything he heard, and this is common in Sufism, that everything the saint hears is an indicator and sign pointing to higher realities, has the double effect of being part of a context and opening a phase in the history of poetry wherein everything Arabic was sacralized in Persianate contexts. And it's because of this very dominance of Sufism and its approach to language itself. And a lot of this is rooted in this 13th century, right? And because as Professor Keshavaz has shown, Rumi's Konya was home to many other people, including Sadruddin Qunawi, the son-in-law of the famous Andalusian Sufi Ibn al-Arabi, and his successor and main interpreter, as well as his student and companion, who we've already been introduced to, Fakhreddine Iraqi. Now, Fakhreddine Iraqi is important for precisely because of the work that Professor Keshavaz mentioned, Lama'at. And I want to just point out here that it's really interesting that this book is called Lama'at. Why? Well, the story of how it was written, which so Lama'at means flashes. It has 28 flashes, all of which are about this of love. And each flash, as the story goes, the Lum'a was written after Iraqi attended Sadruddin Qunawi's lectures on the 28 sections of Ibn al-Arabi's Fusus al-Hikam, Arabic Fusus al-Hikam. And as its name already suggests, it's a mix of Arabic and Persian poetry, as well as prose, which is of course common to the Sufi context, but primarily it's Persian. And he says that he writes this in the context of Ahmad Ghazali, the younger brother of the more famous Abu Hamid Ghazali's Savaneh, apparitions. And this tradition is a Persian tradition of Sufism wherein love is supreme, wherein God is both lover, beloved, and love itself. And in fact, the animating force of all existence. What Iraqi does is bring it into accord, this school into accord with Ibn al-Arabi's teachings and explain the mazhab-e-ishq, the path of love, through Ibn al-Arabi's teachings. And of course, this short text would be incredibly influential in later history of Persian Sufism, as Professor Keshavaz has already pointed out. Now, the triumph of love is tied to language. So he himself writes in this section. He starts with a famous poem that love strums its song behind the veil, whereas a lover to hear its songs. With every breath it plays another melody. At every moment a new string is plucked. And he switches to prose after that, saying that in every time and in every language, love speaks its secret to its own ears. In every breath, through every ear, it hears its own words through its own language. And note how he's already mixing Arabic and Persian. So the yellow part is translation of Arabic line that he gives himself, that he composes. Now he connects this, of course, to a larger point in Sufism in the fifth flash, where he says that in the mirror of each moment, the beloved shows another face, and in every breath appears in a different form. And he immediately gives a Persian poem. In each mirror, a changed face shows his beauty with every breath. At times he appears in the garb of Eve. At times he appears in the form of Adam. And he continues this mixing of languages to show that God's revelation is constant and never repeats. Summing it all in an Arabic line of poetry from the early Sufi poet, An-Nuri, our expressions are scattered, but your beauty is one. And to this beauty, all things point. Expression here then, as he's interpreting expression here then to include different languages. And Iraqi in doing so is building on Rumi and Ahmad Ghazali, but also importantly, Ibn al-Arabi, who is clear about the rootedness of human love in God, who is both the beloved and the lover. And we see this both in the Tarjuman al-Ashwaq, when he famously brings the names of all the famous Arab beloveds from Layla to Suad and Hind, writing that they're all lessons and images, but also in the Futuhat, where he says, وإذا قلت هويت زينب أو نظاما أو عنانا فاحكموا إنه رمز بديع حسن تحته ثوب رفيع مؤلم. If I say I desire Zainab or Nizam or Anan, understand that this is all a riddle, a novel, badi', beautiful, under which there is a lofty garment, a signpost. So like Rumi, he says that all human love is love for God. And creation itself is a process of God loving humanity. And the worldly beloveds are all veils, similar to the way that language is a veil that keeps them from realizing that. And true to his own style, he continues this theme in the Futuhat about God, saying, and in a really interesting passage, he says that our states call him in realized calling, and he takes names appropriate to them. This is why the words vary, as well as the composition of their letters in keeping with language, even if the meaning that necessitates each name is known to the creatures. Thus the Arab says, Ya Allah. So that which the Persian says, Ay Khudai, and the Greek says, Ay Thia, which I guess is Theos, and the Armenian says, Ay Asfach, and the Turks say, Ay Tundra, and the Franks say, Ay Kreator, and the Ethiopian calls Wal. The phrases are diverse, but they are for a single meaning that intended by every created thing, because the beloved with whatever name he calls the lover responds. And here he's talking about God as the lover. That is, God with whatever name he is called, he responds. That is, he takes on the form that is given to him. And this, of course, has bearing for poetry, right? Because poetry is a form. Mulamma poetry composed in this tradition becomes a means of bringing the presence and a flash of the beloved's face into the mirror in place of a new language. And so this understanding helps us to understand the work of a 14th century Turkic poet who I've spent years working on it now, and who's the subject of my book project, and a poet who actually consciously placed himself in the tradition of Rumi, Ibn al-Arabi, and Iraqi. That is, he studied all of them, he responds to all of them. Now, this poet was actually a king. His name is Burhanuddin Ahmad, remembered in Turkey today as Qadi Burhanuddin. He ruled over Sivas and Qaysari in eastern Anatolia, and he was a judge and a scholar who, as Professor Kashava has noted, he was also a traveler. That is, in his youth, he went to Egypt, Syria, and the Hijaz for many years before coming back to Qaysari and to work as a judge. And this is before he became a king. Now, he becomes a king in 1381 through a mixture of intrigue and chance, which we can talk about if you're interested, but I won't get into. But he's famous as an early poet of high courtly Anatolian Turkish poetry. And in fact, the copy of his divan in beautiful naskh with multicolored pages and ink, which is pictured here, was completed in 1394, 4 years before he would die. when he was still in power, and it contains about 1,319 Turkish Old Anatolian Turkish ghazals, as well as a smaller amount of rubai, about 20, and about 119 tuyuk, which is a uniquely Turkic form of poetry. There are also some extant Arabic qasaid that are attributed to him, as well as and he also wrote 2 Arabic prose rotes, again in the last 4 years of his reign, before he would die. These are, one is a treatise on the theory of Islamic law, and the other is on Ibn Arabi's metaphysics. And while there is a strong tradition of primarily oral Turkic poetry before him, like he's not in any way the first. In fact, what he's doing is that he's building on it. He does possess one of the earliest extant manuscripts of Turkic poetry that we have, and certainly one of the first written by the king. And while the 14th century in Anatolia witnesses an explosion of written Turkish, most of it styles itself as a translation or interpretation of Arabic or Persian, whereas Burhanuddin is conscious of his own novelty. And this is high court poetry. Like the poets we saw today, it's fully imbibed in Sufism, and Burhanuddin himself was an initiate of the Rifai Sufi order, but he chose to write in this language in a multilingual context, in a context where Arabic, Persian, and Turkish all had currency. And so and therefore what he's doing here is very much tied to his active kingship. That is, in a post-Caliphal, post-Mongol age, wherein the old ways of legitimacy don't work, how does a king show that he is legitimate? He shows it by being like Muhammad. And what is Muhammad's miracle? Muhammad's miracle is to bring a book that brings people together. So here then the act of producing poetry becomes tied to poetry in a new language. And by responding through it to the saints of the past, he makes it a divine book, right? That he makes it a book that is imbibed with their sacred presence to prove that he's a shadow of God. And it's important to note here briefly that within a decade of the completion of Burhanuddin's divan, his political rivals and other kings actually begin composing their own divans, which is what I had originally intended to talk about, but we could talk about it in the questions if you want. Now, as I mentioned, Burhanuddin's poetry is primarily in the tradition of Rumi and Iraqi. He has many poems that respond to those of Rumi, both in meter, rhyme, as well as themes. And like Rumi, he consciously takes no pen name, instead ending many of his poems by referring to his beloved as the true king and ruler. And similar to Iraqi, he does a lot of the same with Iraqi. And in fact, the poem that I shared earlier is one of the first poems in the Persian history of his reign that was composed in 1398 for him. So Iraqi is definitely there. And he emphasizes in his poetry that his language choice is for the sake of his beloved, and that he doesn't need particularly in that he doesn't need an interpreter. So notice he's choosing to write this kind of Turkish poetry at a time, consciously saying that he doesn't need an interpreter, right? So he says in one part, he says, "Ben Turkem o sen Tatar yoli la soruşalım." I'm a Turk and you're a Tatar. We should talk straight, right? Or in another place he says that Ben soylayamazım sözüme tercüman ile. That is, at the beginning he says, "I saw you, I love you, my intimate sweetheart, but I can't say my words anymore with an interpreter." Or in another line he says, "Gönülden vir verem ana sözümü, dahi yalvarmazam her tercümana." I get from my heart, I give him my words directly. I won't beg from an interpreter anymore. So he's clear in these that he has transcended the interpreter, the middleman, and moved to an experience wherein his words to the beloved are conveyed through his own language directly. And in so doing, he claims, therefore, that he has been transformed by the same experience that transformed the saints of the past, who he's constantly citing, such as Rumi and them. And this is part of his notion. And he says this actually in another line, and I think I'm going over right now, right? I've gone over. So let me try to finish up. Do I have a few minutes?
Yes, please.
Okay. So he says in one line that he says that, I love you, he says, ben seni severim, sevisarım, bu sözü Türkçe koyuk diyelim, vasfını gah kaside gah gazal gah rubai gah tuyuk dilem. I love you, my diyelim. I love you, my beloved. Let me say these words to you thickly in Turkish. Let me describe you at times through a qasida, at times through a ghazal, at times through a rubai, and at times through a tuyuk, using a word for thick that gives this sense of intimacy, but also texture, right? To show the relationship of both him to his beloved as well as Turkish to other languages. Now, I wanted to end, since I'm going over, on a mulamma poem of his, which is the ghazal to the right, which is a mix of Persian and Turkish, but the Persian bits are lines from the late 13th to early 14th century poet Humamuddin Tabrizi, which itself is a response to a series of poems by Iraqi as well as Sa'di. Burhanuddin's poem goes Nigarina bizimle niçe bir kılır nazi, niçe asir ede keklik cihanda şahbazi, gözün hata ise gözüme oldu aynı sebab, به یک کرشمه توانی که کار ما سازی تمام olur benim işim چو bir نظر کلاسن ولی بیچارگان نپردازی. So beloved, with us, how does one get an act of flirtation in this world? How did the partridge imprison the falcon? The betrayal of your eyes or the mistake of your eyes is to my eyes is the same as propriety. With a single flirtatious glance, you can set my work aright. So he's consciously weaving his Turkish into the first two lines of the poem that you see to the left, making clear who he is responding to. But also note the last line. He says, Labun görale yaqin oldu bana Turki masal ki her nesanede nazuk durur ozi ve azi. The vision of your lips has become certain for me in a Turkish image or idiom, Turki masal. Because like masal means both image, idiom, right, proverb. But here he's building on this Ibn Arabian notion of masal, such that in its every object, it is tender, short, and sweet. So in addition to being another expression of how the beloved's beauty is being described in Turkish, it's actually building on this long chain of poetic responses that Humam's poem is actually already evoking. Because if you look at the end of it, what is he saying at the end? He's saying Humam's speech is sweet, it enchants the heart. But what benefit is the poor hopeless one isn't Shirazi, because this is a response to Sa'di's poem, saying that I'm not Sa'di. This is why no one pays attention to how great my language is. But what's interesting is that the poem that he's responding to in Sa'di, one of three poems actually, at the end of it, Sa'di says, "Chu'ab mi ravat in Parsi be quvvat tab, na markabi ist ke az vey sabaq barad tazi." Saying that this Persian flows like water of its own natural power. It isn't a mount, using a word that also means ship, from which Arabic can surpass. Using here the Persian word for Arabic, which also means horse, right? So he's saying in the race of language towards meaning, I've reached a position, Sa'di is saying, where my Persian is as beautiful, as deep in meaning as Arabic, right? And this is part of the miracle of Sa'di, right? And his style, right? But what's interesting here is that this is the poem, because Burhanuddin actually doesn't do that much mulamma'at. So this is the poem that he chooses to do talmi on. And it's in this chain of language that Sa'di, like the other masters of Persian poetry in the 13th century, has brought Persian to such a level that technically it is as badi and as beautiful as Arabic, while also through the saints is as infused with God's presence as the Arabic which had the Quran. I mean, Rumi's Masnavi is famously called the Quran in Persian, right? And thus from there, Burhanuddin is able to use that Persian to intertwine God's thread, now Persianized from its Arabic roots, through the others into a Turki masal, right? And unlike others, he's actually, in the other poems by Iraqi and Humam and Sa'di, they all talk about how they're magnificent birds. And he actually says in the beginning, how did a simple partridge capture a falcon? Hiding behind the same poetic humility that prevents his taking a pen name, the full magnitude of the sort of badi'a nature of what he's doing with Turkic poetry. I've gone over those, so thank you so much for listening to this talk and for your time.
Thank you, Ali. My private compliments went out to everyone, so now everyone knows you have an admirer in New York. I'd like to move on now, while again asking everyone to hold back your questions until our last panelist has completed her paper. This is Zeynep Oktay-Uslu, who studied comparative literature in the United States at Dartmouth College and classical Turkish literature at Boğaziçi University in Turkey. She completed her PhD in Islamic civilization at the Sorbonne in the École Pratique des Hautes Études. Her dissertation, entitled The Perfect Man in Alevism and Bektashism, was based on the earliest written texts of Alevi Bektashi literature dating from the 14th to the 17th century. She currently holds the position of assistant professor at the Department of Turkish Language and Literature at Boğaziçi University. Her publications include a translation into Turkish of Henri Corbin's creative imagination in the Sufism of Ibn Arabi, and a recent article entitled Alevism as Islam, Rethinking Shahab Ahmed's Conceptualization of Islam Through Alevi Poetry. And this is for the British Journal of Middle Eastern Studies. Her paper today is entitled Sufi Metaphysics as Literary Theory, Sheikh Ghalib's Beauty and Love. Please, Zeynep, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, David, and everyone here for this wonderful conference. I already have so many more questions than I did before, and I think that is perhaps one of the things that makes a conference great. I'm going to be presenting a case study today, and I'm a little bit nervous because I'm talking about a masterpiece that a lot of people have talked about. So here's my effort to say something new. But as Ghalib says, that the effort for originality, that is never, the sea of originality can never be dried up. So here it goes. Oh, and my screen. 1 second. Okay. I'm going to leave a structural map on the screen for you while I talk, because it takes a little while, I think, to take in, and I will come back to it. I mean, I will be talking about it throughout. So anyway, eminent Ottoman poet of the 18th century, Sheikh Ghalib was the quintessential multilingual Ottoman Sufi. He was the head of the Mevlevi Lodge of Galata in Istanbul and the author of works in both Turkish and Arabic. Ghalib came from a family of 3 generations of influential Mevlevi dervishes. He was the close friend and sheikh of Selim III, and during his time, his lodge became a booming center for the arts. Ghalib's magnum opus is an allegorical work of narrative poetry in Turkish, the Mesnevian romance named Hüsnü Aşk, Beauty and Love. Hüsnü Aşk narrates a love story of 2 characters named Hüsn, beauty, and Aşk, love. The mystical journey of Aşk to unite with his beloved Hüsn is filled with characters with various conceptual names, the most prominent of whom is Aşk's spiritual master Sühan, word, a major avenue for Ghalib's expression of his understanding of spiritual and poetic language. Starting with the Republican period in Turkey, several scholars have offered various interpretations of Hüsnü Aşk, the most famous of these being Abdülbaki Gölpınarlı and Victoria Holbrook. In her Unreadable Shores of Love, the latter offered an in-depth analysis of Ghalib's understandings of poetry, love, and the universe that also took into account the text's modern reception. My talk today is an attempt to offer a more closely knit structure to Holbrook's scattered avenues of interpretation, while agreeing and disagreeing with some of the interpretive choices made by her and other commentators. Of course, there's a lot that I wanted to say here, so, and 20 minutes proved to be very, very short. So, and also to add that this is a work in progress, and I'm very open to suggestions. I aim to interpret Sheikh Ghalib's Hüsnü Aşk along 2 major axes. The first is the influence of the thought of Ibn Arabi and the doctrine of the oneness of being. The second is the role of Jalaluddin Rumi in the production of the work, whom Ghalib refers to as the Anatolian prophet. Ghalib's conceptualization of language and literature exemplifies a creative synthesis of these 2 spheres of influence. Rumi is identified with Sühan in the text as Ghalib's own spiritual master, while the Mesnevi, the model for Ghalib's artistic creation, is described as the essence of the Quran. Sühan is also the barzakh, the limit between the purely physical and purely intelligible realms, between the beloved and the lover. First, a short summary of the work is in order for those who haven't read it. The work begins with sections in praise of God, the Prophet, with a section on his ascension, Rumi, and Ghalib's own father, Rashid Effendi, who was his first Sufi master. In accord with the Mesnevi romance genre, beauty and love are together in their early childhood, where they're part of a tribe named Beni Muhabbet, Sons of Love, and attend a school named Mektebi Edeb, the School of Proper Conduct, or the School of Learning. I'm using a modern Turkish transliteration just to make things easier. And they're then together in a place named the Nusetgah Mana, the Garden of Meaning, where their guide is a person named Suhan, word. Husn falls in love with Ashk, but Ashk fails to reciprocate. The two lovers are then separated by a figure named Hayret, bewilderment, who is the leader of the tribe. I will have to skip some details due to time constraints. This separation ignites the hidden love in Ashk, but his request to marry Husn is refused by the elders of the tribe, who tell Ashk to go on a journey to the land of the heart and obtain the alchemy there. Ashk goes on this journey with his companion and teacher guided spiritual efforts. During their journey, they encounter several obstacles and are aided by Suhan to overcome them. First, they're trapped by a giant in a well. Then they freeze in an endless steppe. Then they're hung on a cross across from a fire by a witch. Suhan tells Ashk that Husn is the Shah of the land of beauty, and she's the one who has sent him to help Ashk on his journey. They meet Hushruba, the robber of the mind, who is the Chinese emperor's daughter and looks like Husn, but lacks the ability to speak. Hushruba entraps Ashk in the castle of the essence of form, Zat-ı-Suver. When Ashk has weakened to the point of dying, Suhan appears in the form of an old doctor and takes him to the castle of the heart, where the palace of the Shah is found. But Suhan is told that this palace is nothing but the garden of meaning mentioned earlier, that Husn and Ashk are one and the same. At this point, Suhan tells Ashk that his closeness with Suhan is now over. It is Hayret who will be taking Ashk to the Shah. The story ends as Ashk is accompanied by Hayret to the presence of Husn. As you can see, I hope that wasn't too distracting for you while I spoke. As you can see, in my interpretation of the work, I posit 3 levels of allegory, each serving as a mirror image of the others. These depict the manifestation of the universe, the Sufi's mystical journey towards God, and the act of writing as expressed by Ghalib's composition of Husn Ashk. In the first level of the allegory, that of the mystical journey, Ashk is the wayfarer and Husn is God. This allegory partakes in the narrative structures of Attar's famous Conference of the Birds, a fact openly expressed by Ghalib. When Suhan is compared to the Hoopoe in the beginning of the journey, at the end of the work, when Ashk finally arrives at the castle of the heart, this place is likened to Mount Kaf and its doors resemble the sea mook. Ashk's entire spiritual journey ends with his realization that he had always been one with God. By the way, also in the beginning of the work, Ghalib speaks reverently of Attar. The Beni Muhabbet in this allegory is the dervish order or the Sufi community in general. Ghalib describes this tribe as all those who have experienced spiritual suffering. So, 1 second, I have to move so I can see the English version. Those poets who give life to the word say that Majnun was from that tribe. Of course, there's a whole area of reference to Fuzuli's Layla wa Majnun, which I'm not going to get into, and Masnavi romances. Whoever is entangled in trouble is, of course, a member of this tribe. According to this level of the allegory, the initial unity between God and the lover can be identified with one's spiritual state in childhood, where the wayfarer has not yet reached the spiritual maturity to become aware of his separation from God. In the tale, the Mektebi Edeb, in which the lovers are together, is described as a place in which togetherness and separation have not yet been differentiated. Ashk's failure to reciprocate Husn love can be interpreted as the wayfarer's inability to let go of his ego. Ghalib's descriptions of this failure underline Ashk's preoccupation with his own selfhood. The path begins when Hayret, bewilderment, separates the two lovers, when the wayfarer recognizes himself as God's beloved and the spiritual awareness of separation emerges. After the wayfarer passes several spiritual obstacles, which Holbrook identifies with various human faculties, he arrives at the castle of Hushruba, a personification of the world of the seen, Alim Shahadet. In this level of the allegory, the wayfarer's entrapment in the castle can be interpreted as a spiritual level in which the wayfarer experiences God's beauty in her creation and feels a contentment that hinders his achievement of oneness with God, possible only when all else is abandoned. The reason for Holbrook's rejection of this level of the allegory, underlined by previous commentators, despite it being the most obvious, was her focus on another level of allegory, that of an ontological explication of the universe, number 3 in our chart. As underlined by Holbrook, Ghalib's ontology is based on an Akbari understanding of theophany and presences. Several verses openly express the sphere of influence. In a passage entitled Dar Vücud-u Sühan, on the existence of the word, Ghalib undertakes an Akbari explication of Vücud. Wait one moment. If we accept their existence in the outside world, locus of theophany and the name are like twins. Prior to revival and death, God, the most beneficent, was already the reviver. Yet the created and the act of creation were joined in the name of the creator. The names change form at each moment. The movements of the skies thus change with them. Do not think that opposites come from the essence. All the traces come forth from the attributes. This short passage makes reference to the Ibn Arabi's or Akbari doctrines of theophany, God's names and attributes, perpetual recreation, and the coincidence of opposites. According to this level of the allegory, Husn is God's essence, her oneness prior to creation. Creation begins with the truth of Muhammad. Let me go back. Yes, creation begins with the truth of Muhammad. This is oneness that is knowledge of itself. There is thus the separation of the knower and the known, of the esoteric and the exoteric. However, this known selfhood is still one and only one. That is, the universe exists within it as an undifferentiated potential. Ghalib expresses this as the oneness of Ahadiyat and Ahmadiyat. Those who are companions to oneness say the waves of Ahadiyat and Ahmadiyat are one. I'm trying to move my screen at the same time. This is the initial oneness of Husn and Ashq, particularly stressed in the passages in which Ashq is described with divine qualities, such as when his lovers are described as saying, Erini, show me to him, as Moses said to God in the Quran. The Beni Muhammad corresponds to the ontological level of Wahidiyat, in which God's names and attributes have manifested themselves within God's knowledge. Nusretgah-ı Mana, the place described with qualities of paradise in the text, corresponds to the pre-eternal pact, where the souls of all created beings attest to the oneness of God. Whose initially unreciprocated love for Ashq, which Ashq later tells us was nothing but keeping his deity's suffering secret, posits love as the reason for the creation of the universe, in line with the path of Ahmed al-Ghazali, in regards to which Ghalib mentions the hadith of, if it weren't for you, I would not have created heavens, as we will see below. Husn expresses this with phrases such as, if his wish is to see the full moon, let me be the night. If he likes to watch the skies, let me be a star. Ashq's separation from Husn corresponds to the creation of the world of the seen, the universe as we know it. This is the Qaws al-Nuzul, the arc of descent, of presences all the way to the perfect man, the physical being of the Prophet, in whom the arc of ascent, al-Qaws al-Uruj, is complete. This arc is none other than the Prophet's ascension. Considering that the Prophet's ascension is the archetype of the wayfarer's spiritual path, we can say that the two above-mentioned levels of allegory are deeply intertwined. As Holbrook also underlined, the priority of levels of manifestation is not a temporal priority, but an ontological one. The ontology of the downward arc is paralleled by the epistemology of the upward arc, that is, the Prophet's and the perfect man's knowledge of God and the universe. While Holbrook saw Ghalib's calls to the Saki, cup-bearer for inspiration, as well as his ruminations on language and poetry as digressions, in my reading of the work, they appear to conform to the same allegorical structure as the above-mentioned allegorical levels. One reason for Holbrook's perspective was her translation of Sühan as poetry, thus putting a linguistic barrier between the word of the poet and the word of God, the unity of which is manifested in the way the different allegorical levels mirror one another. Ashq himself, in his supplication to God to save him from the castle in which he's trapped, says, "O Lord, do not punish me for using," same thing, can't seem to move. I'm just going to. It's okay. Do not punish me for using metaphor, because my use of metaphor and simile is only to be able to say these words. Similarly, within the tale, members of the tribe tell Aşk not to show effort and desire for poetry because it makes you think the imaginary is real. In my reading of the work, Galip's maturation as a poet and its composition of Hüsnü Aşk form another allegorical level, in which Galip identifies himself with Aşk, and God is referred to as the cupbearer and asks for inspiration in several passages that interrupt the tale. In his first call to the cupbearer, Galip asks the cupbearer to offer the wine of inspiration, which is nothing but gum, suffering. O cupbearer, help me, I'm helpless and poor. I'm an aspirant to suffering in the market of calamity. I need a lot of cash of words to become a buyer of various kinds of suffering. Words, but those that come from intoxication, from fallenness and brokenness. Give me wine, the word has come to an end. The capital of suffering has run out. With this joy, the cupbearer of the wine of the gathering of meaning began to bestow soul, whose longing increased. The moon, like the moon, she shrunk with pain day by day. We see something interesting happening here. It is only after Galip asks God for inspiration and is offered it in the form of suffering that the story is able to continue. A fact made more apparent by the addition of a subject title right before the couplet, in which we're told that the poet's supplication has been answered. This is why, in contrast with Holbrook's reading, I'm not inclined to identify the author of the so-called digressions with Holbrook's term of order, which she tries not to identify with Galip himself. In my opinion, these passages are as autobiographical as the below-mentioned passages on Rashid Efendi and Rumi. They offer us a glimpse of the poet in the act of creation. Let me go back just for a moment to my first slide. According to this lever of the allegory, the Molla-i Cünun is Galip's own father, Reşid Efendi, to whom he refers as his first master. Reşid Efendi is the person who advised Galip to add the section on the Prophet's ascension and who guided him towards Rumi's poetry when he was younger. Unfortunately, I have a 14-month-old and known many on Eid, so I haven't been able to finish translating and all of my poetry, but I think maybe this is a good thing, because now you will be hearing some Turkish, and I will just try giving you a translation on the spot. Na güfte kalıp mata miraç, kalmıştı bu hüsnü aşk bir taş. Söyle deyip etkin utka ikdam, feyzi nefesiyle oldu itmam. Bu gümrehin oldu destgiri, öğretti sühanda tarzı piri. Ne gibi beni o zatı vala, feyzi nefesiyle kıldı güya. So it is as I said before, it is his father who has advised him to add the section on the ascension, and from his childhood onwards, he's the one who taught him the tarzı pir. And Sühan, on the other hand, represents none other than Rumi, whose Mesnevi served as the ultimate guide for Galip, both in his spiritual quest as well as his self-education and achievement as a poet. We will see soon that these two are inseparable. As mentioned earlier, Galip calls Rumi the Anatolian prophet and refers to the Mesnevi as the essence of the Quran. Oldu ulemayı dine faik, peygamberi Rum denirse layık, manayı kelamı ruh bahşa, which, if you remember, was ruh bahşa was the exact same phrase we saw earlier in the supplication to the Saki. Mehdi gibi şer'i eyler ihya. İsm olmadı bir kitaba el-an, seyret şerefin ki mağzı Kur'an. He likens Galip likens Rumi to Jesus and the Mehdi. In a similar fashion, Sühan is referred to in his first description as Nebi-i Mürsel, God-sent prophet. Sühan has the capacity to take different shapes, give life, and make opposites causes of one another. Galip devotes a long passage at the end of his work to the influence of Rumi. Esrarını Mesnevi'den aldım, çaldım veli miri malı çaldım. So this was, he stole from common property. Envar-ı fiyuz-ı mürşid-i Rum, Afake füruğum etti malum. Kıldı beni tıflı mısra asa, doğdum doğalı sühanla berpa. So even as a child, thanks to Rumi, he was able to speak poetry. Bir minneti üstadı talim, sername hitabım etti tanzim. Feyz erdi Cenab-ı Mevlevi'den, aldım niçe ders Mesnevi'den. So, in this level of the allegory, Hüşrüba corresponds to the alim misal, the imaginal world, one of the presences in Ibn Arabi's cosmogony. Via his imaginative faculty, the poet and the wali, the two are inseparable in this case, is able to summon existence in the imaginal world to the world of the seen. As Holbrook also underlines, this theoretical perspective is the framework for Ghalib's discourse on originality, wherein the possibility for original art can never be exhausted. As an act of bringing unseen images and words to the world of the seen, poetry is an act of creation, one that mirrors the creation of the universe. As Aşk's savior in his adventures, Sühan suddenly appears on scene to save Aşk, an act that is said to resemble God's command be that created the universe. The correlation between different levels of the allegory are thus made bare. The Sufi master's instruction of the disciple and the master poet's inspiration of the poet to be are posited as creative acts that resemble the creative act of God. Ghalib stresses that his creative power is aided by the feyz-i himmet, the blessing of spiritual power, and the feyz-i nefes, blessing of the breath, of his father Reşid Efendi, which we just saw, Rumi, and Shams. He refers to all three of them. The word nefes is particularly relevant in this context and allows us to understand why Aşk is repeatedly likened to Jesus in his descriptions. Like Jesus, the character Aşk, that is the perfect man and poet, breathes life into the world with his words. In this regard, the words of the saint are like the Quran, which is the carrier of the names and attributes of God via which the universe becomes manifest. In one couplet under the section named On the Nature of Poetryhood, Ghalib calls poetic inspiration Vahidi, the revelation to the heart. This is quite famous. Similarly, Sühan is referred to in the text as the sharer of Gabriel's secret, the guard of the treasure of revelation. He is the holder of the treasure of God's names. His arrival to take Aşk to the castle of the heart is described as a descent, like the descent of the light of the Quran. As one of the personifications of Sühan, Ghalib draws parallels between Rumi's relationship to the Mesnevi and the prophet's relationship to the Quran as the duality of meaning and form. According to Ghalib, the Quran carries the attributes of the prophet. Yes. His pure essence is described with, if it weren't for you. His attributes are to the Quran like the contained and the container. The Prophet's ascension is nothing but the return of the Quran to the skies, the way everything returns to its source. Just as Sühan is unable to accompany Aşk in the final moments of his journey as he unites with God, so is Gabriel unable to continue with Muhammad beyond the Sidra tree. For Ghalib, this is a moment meaning, mana, leaves behind the form of the word, etfaz. Insofar as the various allegories within the text mirror one another, allegory number 2, the creation of Hüsnü Aşk, also partakes in a theory of the cycle. The downward arc culminates with the beginning of Hüsnü Aşk, while the upward arc corresponds to its end, culminating in silence. The ending of the text, a mirror image of the return of the Quran to the skies. This also allows us to open a new avenue for interpreting Ghalib's frequent references to the impossibility of expressing God's majesty and oneness, a common Sufi trope. Indeed, Ghalib ends his work with words expressing his failure at his task. Again, quite often we see the similar trope and something similar in Attar as well. I remained and those words stayed on my lips. The boat of my desire has pulled up its anchor. To conclude, Ghalib's multilingual mystical universe is one where each great piece of literary creation has to define its own theoretical outlook on language and literature. This outlook, which is the key to unlocking the various allegorical layers in the text, demands a dynamic and personal engagement with previous conceptualizations within the multicultural Islamic universe. In this regard, Ghalib's masterpiece is a unique adaptation of the doctrine of the oneness of being to the concept of language and literary creation. In this creative act, where the mystical and poetic are inseparable, his greatest muse and teacher is none other than Mevlana Celaleddin Rumi. Thank you. That was the end of my talk. I don't know how much I don't know if I went over. I didn't check the time before I started. But
Oh, I assure you, Zeynep, it was all necessary. Thank you. Thank you to all of our panelists of the first session. At the hazard of cutting into our scheduled break time, I'd like to open things up to comments and questions. They haven't yet come to me in the chat. So I'm going to take a little liberty, which is to turn to Claire Lyon. And I wanted to ask specifically about the Richardson translation, which, forgive me, I don't know. I'm going to have to check out this early English version of Hafiz's Diwan. And my question for Claire, I hope you can hear me, Claire, is it's about the consequences of Richardson's use of that commentary tradition, which, I mean, the point of your paper came through very well, that there is a habitual Western misrecognition, yeah, of the status of Sharh and Hashia and commentary, as well as Mukhtasar and the many other secondary and tertiary forms we could mention. I'd just like to know, Claire, if it's okay, I'd like to ask about any specific consequences in Richardson's text of his use of surur and suri. I know you mentioned that suri was the more philological of the commentators. The pragmatic advantages of that for a translator are easy to see, but help us see some of what's not so obvious to them. I mean, to those of us who don't know Richardson.
So let me briefly so just answer. So what Richardson is doing is that so you first have the Persian ghazal in, well, actually I shouldn't even say Persian because it's, you know, it's Persian and Arabic. I mean, we're already dealing with two languages, but it's Hafiz. And then he provides a paraphrase where he calls a paraphrase, and then comes a third moment where you have transliteration with scanning plus notes. And so the comment, so for each ghazal, this is what you have, this is the pattern. And at the end, so in the notes, there are grammatical notes, okay? And they are what he calls the cultural notes, the historical notes. And this is where, so sometimes, so what's interesting is that sometimes he does mention the name of Sururi, for instance, and other commentators. But this is so to dismiss them because of their, you know, sort of mystical interpretation. Actually, at some point, it's very interesting. He says, well, we know about this interpretation, but we're not really interested in it because you, reader, are reading this poem because you want to learn the language. And yeah, perhaps you want to be entertained about, you know, love, falling in love, etc. But that's either philological or entertaining. And this is why when he mentions the commentator, this is to dismiss him. I hope you can hear me properly. What was I going to say? And also, when I talk about erasure, this is because he systematically mentions in the grammatical explanation he goes back to Meninsky, and he goes back to all other Orientalists, without saying that these other Orientalists actually built the grammars on the Persian, Arabic, Turkish lexicographers. So it's all this. Yeah, I hope I was kind of clear.
No, thank you.
Thank you for your question.
Quite clarifying. Thank you. And again, to all our panelists, I'd like now to open the floor to all of our hearers spread across the time zones to advance your own questions to Claire, Ali, and Zeynep, our panelists.
Can I?
Yes, please.
Let me just first say how delighted I am with the quality of the work being presented here. It's just absolutely stunning, all of the presentations. And you just not only display an amazing control of the linguistic medium that you work with, but the way you're thinking about it. And just a reminder to all of us that what is invisible is not because it's not important, it's because we haven't recognized it. That's why it's invisible. And I think this is so important that we are all going back to these. But a quick note about commentary and the significance of commentary that so many of you, I think, have touched on. It's also important to remember that authors of these commentaries actually thought of their commentaries as independent works in their own right. And so they were composing, as far as they were concerned, they were composing a whole new work. Now, the original work was a podium from which they spoke. Now, and an example of that is that, as you mentioned, Ali and others, that, that Lama'at of Iraqi is a commentary on Fusus al-Hakam, and we decipher that. But later on, a person no less than Jami, Abdurrahman Jami, writes the Asha'at al-Lama'at, which is then a commentary on the Lama'at, but very much a work in its own right. So that's, you're all onto something really good. So thank you. I just pointing that out.
I see your hand, Huda. Please speak up.
Yes, thank you. Well, thank you all. This was a brilliant panel. I'd like to also second Professor Fatima's opinion. And I'd like to borrow from Zeynep, as literary theory, that phrase in your title, and think about what can pass as literary theory. Our fields are always accused of a lack of theorizing or critical thought. And I think this panel really argued against that very convincingly. And also to take what Claire did with the term palimpsest and commentary as being places where critical thought happens, even though it's erased and deliberately made invisible. Take all that to ask Ali this question about the mulamma and its connection to the tradition of mu'arada. So it might seem as if it's a mu'arada across languages, but it's also a form where criticism happens, where a poet not only comments on what he's doing and what others whom he's citing have done, and how he can somehow one-up them if he wants, but also a space to comment critically and to think about motifs and genres that are shared across traditions and languages. So the mulamma as theory as well. So can you just comment briefly or just thank you for allowing me to make these connections, all three of you. But I'd like to hear Ali talk a little bit more about the mulamma and how you connect it to the mu'arada in Arabic and maybe the mu'arada in Persian, or all of them together, placed in a room and forced to have a fruitful conversation.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good question. Thank you so much for that question and comment. And of course, it's difficult for me to speak to my own teachers as if I have something to offer. But yes, definitely. I think a lot of what's going in Mulamma'at, particularly the types that I showed today, is a type of critical response, found it at showing, in a sense, if we're going to take it like critically, it's what it's doing is that it's sort of carving out a space that shows the limits of those whose language was considered to be beyond limit, or had surpassed limit. So like in the case of Saadi, for instance, which I showed today, right, via Humamuddin Tabrizi. And of course, contemporary hearers will probably think this is ridiculous, right? Because Burhanuddin, for complicated reasons, doesn't really have a reception history until the modern period, right? But you know, Burhanuddin in several other ghazals where he does a type of marada, but not through mulamma, but it builds on this poem and other themes. He talks about he talks about Shiraz as a space, right? And that it's because of Shiraz that like Humamuddin, that it's because of Shiraz that Saadi became the Saadi that he is, right? But that if God wanted, he could have made Sivas into Shiraz too, right? Trying to sort of therefore open up the sort of geographic space to be like, hey, and of course here also the fact that he's using a Tabrizi poet to make space is also because Tabriz, Sivas, and Eastern Anatolia with northern Iraq, these were all considered in a single region, right? So yeah, there's this sort of aspect of both carving space and particularly showing that there is still something left to be said. And I think that's where I'm sort of interested in it, that especially because, you know, when you hear a lot of critiques of late Turkish and late Persian and late Arabic poetry, it's like, oh, this is all like useless poetry. This is, and actually, you know, I've been on a Twitter fast because Twitter is horrible for you, but I saw that someone retweeted this conference from my account and said that there's nothing left to be said about this later poetry. This is all dead. This is a waste of time. And I was like, oh, okay. But actually what they're doing through Ma'arada and through Mulamma in particular is showing actually the amount of meaning you can gain through it is endless. And a new language gives you a whole range of new meaning that you can bring. And that the beloved can show his self or herself or itself in a way that you've never seen before, right? And he's clear about this in it. And also, you know, the play in Turkish, you know, if I had time, there's an 18th century poem I wanted to read for you guys, a Mulamma from Hijaz, from a Sufi, and many of you probably know him, but I won't get into it because we didn't have time. But in that Mulamma, it's really interesting because he mixes Arabic and Persian. But unlike the Mulamma'at that you see in Persian, where the Arabic sort of is fit into Persian or Persian fits into it, he Persianizes Arabic in it. And then when he finally speaks to his beloved, the beloved responds in Turkish, because the beloved was always Turk, but the beloved never spoke back in his own language, but he makes it so that the beloved speaks back. And this is happening from Abbas al-Makki al-Musawi, who lived most of his life in Mecca and Mukha in Yemen. But it's showing, and this poem is so popular that in Kuwait in the early 20th century, it was put to song. So clearly a lot of it also just opens up this critical space of thinking of, you know, we always think about Anatolia or Iran or Central Asia or South Asia, but it's like here, the very birthplace of Arabic too, that Talmi goes back, right? It has a way of going back and sort of influencing it.
Wow, excellent.
I have a question.
Please, Hany, you have the floor.
So I have to add my voice also to thank the panel. It was more than brilliant. Each one has a lot of questions. I'm sure everyone now is struggling in his head to get it. Yeah, my question is for Zeynep. I really liked how you managed to analyze the Sheikh Ghalib metaphors and similes. And I wanted to actually touch on what you mean by Sufi metaphysics as a literary theory. So usually when we speak about like a metaphor as a literary theory or simile as literary theory, so metaphysics, I know it's this metaphysics concept of, I think it's based on Euro-American definition, metaphysics. So is there an equivalent in Turkish invented by Sheikh Ghalib himself to define metaphysics? I can't, in Arabic as well, I'm trying to think about the equivalent of metaphysics, or in Persian as well. So here we speak about agency and indigenous terms that can be also brought up during the discussion.
Thank you. That is a great question, because if you think about it, I mean, the title itself was, I think, an act of translation on my part from one cultural sphere to another, right? So, and that was just the title. So there was none of that within the talk. So there is a lot to say there. I mean, metaphysics, as I think, the thing is, for example, the difference here, I think, between, in particular, like the Wujudi school, like and between Islamic philosophy and Sufi thought, I can't say it in more general terms, is that, you know, for example, I said ontology and epistemology, and I use those words, but all of these are, as you say, have histories within the Western tradition, and are sort of like a compartmentalization of knowledge that has its own history that we don't have. That is why I think it doesn't make sense to look for exact terms for the same things, as there is no term for literary theory. Why would there be a theory of that is just literary? You know, that is the thing, I think, and even the use of theory and theory that is, for example, the idea of a secular theory versus a religious theory. How can we even posit a difference between those two in a sphere where the two are deeply intertwined, and the philosophical and the religious as well? So, so my answer to your question would be, I think that, you know, the reason I put that title was, and I think that was, I think it was Huda who said something about that, was that this is actually a theory of literature that is not only a theory of literature, it is also a theory of language. It is also a theory of existence, of cosmogony, of creation of the universe, and a theory of the religion of Islam. And all of these things are the exact same thing. And that being that exact same thing is, I think, why sometimes in the Western discourse we say, well, there is no literary theory, because we're trying to look for something that is other than all this other stuff. I don't know if that makes sense.
Can I follow up?
Yeah.
On that? Is that okay? Okay. I want to add something to that, which is, I think all of us see all too often, that there isn't a local term for this, or they didn't have a word for this and that. And as you point out, Zeynep, I think, first of all, it is that the complexity of what is in front of us needs to be looked at from a different angle, rather than taking that narrow road of, I'm looking for homiletic literature, and then I want to see what they say about that. So that is, from the beginning, sending us in the direction of looking for something that's already defined to be an outside of this whole body of literature. I have always thought that, you know, having spent most of my life with Rumi's poetry, I think if there is ever an opportunity for me, I would love to write about his understanding of language, of poetry, and how does that works And this, nobody will find any of that in any Aruz and Bayan books, but I was often flabbergasted with his complexity, understanding of the complexity of language. At some point he says, I went to the stream of meaning with the jar of my words. And when I put the jar in there, I noticed that the jar and the stream are the same. So this not separating content and form and content and meaning, I mean, that's Jack Derrida for you, but we, unless, it doesn't have to be Jack Derrida either, but what the point is finding ways that make sense to us who've lived this language, worked on it, doesn't matter where we come from, could be Western, Eastern, whatever, and find new ways of going into this literature. And remembering, I think, and I'm going to end here rather than taking over all of this conversation, remembering that all of these different approaches to language, there were means of creating resonance. You create resonance for people who understand, to whom this resonance resonates. So we are dealing with a very complex body of readership for this material that to whom the creation of the Mulamma resonated. That sometimes a commentary on a whole verse of the Quran appeared by calling Prophet Muhammad Shah al-Lawlak. So you have these commentaries and all that. You're familiar with that, so there's no need to repeat that. But what I'm saying is sometimes just going into this vast body of literature, searching for specifics that we are expected to search for are exactly what terribly limit what we are going to find. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Fatima. And forgive me, I see further questions. Salor Avaz Malageri, perhaps your question can fit in the next Q&A. I don't know. I hate to cut anything off, everyone. I really do. As it is, we're doing without our break. Something else I regret. But we must go forward. And with that, I would like to introduce the